Hi, welcome to my talk, Model Templates for Minimal Models of Consciousness. I'm Moritz Kriegleder. I'm a PhD student at the University of Vienna. I have a background in physics and cognitive science. And now, as this happens with this kind of transdisciplinary research that we're doing, now I'm doing my PhD at the philosophy department, something that I've never studied, but I mean, this is what happens. I'm in a philosophy of biology, philosophy of science group, and I'm looking at models of consciousness. I try for my PhD project to take a kind of comparative stance. So I'm interested in the big models, but I'm not specializing in any of them because what I try to advocate for is like to find a common language so that we can compare and make some progress, because I don't think that we need more models of consciousness, but we need a better way to talk about them and maybe come up with some kind of consensus or a kind of perspectival model where we use different models to describe different things that we all put under the umbrella of consciousness. So my talk basically is structured in this way, that I'm going to talk a little bit about about the model landscape for consciousness that we encounter. I mean, here at the conference, we already had a lot of different approaches here. I'll talk a little bit about them. And then I will introduce you to Vanya Wiese's concept of a minimal unifying model that he came up with in the context of models of consciousness. I wish he could be here now to hear my talk, but first, he is not here. And second, he is parallel speaking on Zoom, but I've seen the talk that he's giving already, so I know what he is talking about. But I was hoping to discuss these ideas with him, because last year in Stanford, he presented this minimal unifying model idea, and I want to apply it and see if I get like his green light. The model that I know the most about with my physics background, I went into the free energy principle, which is a theory of cognition from the biological to the human scale, so like from small organisms up to higher cognitive functions. I'm working on that a little bit, so I want to ask if the free energy principle could be understood as a minimal unifying model of consciousness research. And we'll then talk about a little bit what the difficulties are in getting the ontological commitments of computational models. Here we like to talk a lot about the tools that we're using and how the tools work. But the question is, like, how do we interpret these tools? How do we get explanatory power out of them? This is not something that like magically appears out of the maths itself, but how we apply and interpret the mathematical tools that we have. I then go into the model template approach, which is an approach from philosophy of science that helps us to track how mathematical tools travels between disciplines. And I advocate that applying model templates for the scientific study of consciousness could help us to find this common ground, to find this language, and maybe bridge the very strong gaps between some of these theories. So I would like to start with the general overview. As you all know, I guess you all have your favorite models. There are a plethora of models for consciousness available, from like the model from Penrose that we heard about yesterday, from the quantum scale, to informational approaches. Like last year, we had Tognoni here for discussing integrated information theory. The free energy principle, something that I'm working on at the moment, to higher level theories like global workspace or attentional schema theory. The easiest way to divide them up is like either looking at their philosophical assumptions, the ontological commitments that the researchers working on them have, or by the mathematical tools that we apply in the modeling. So for example, category theory versions, or like information theory, classical computation ideas, like all these different mathematical approaches that we take. We can divide our models here. For the philosophical part, just going to mention that real quick because that's not my main interest, but I think it's important to see how these ontological commitments come about. And I just did like a very short overview for like the difference between dualism and monism. Many of you already have worked on that. I heard a lot of like beer discussions already if we should take a dualism or monist picture of consciousness. Famous dualists, obviously, Descartes' body and mind separation, Chalmers' property dualism, then more physicalist approaches. We heard a lot of them yesterday. A lot of them inspired by quantum physics. So you have the Penrose model about the orchestrated objective reduction, and Daniel Dennett's multiple draft model could also be understood as a physicalist idea of consciousness. Then today in the morning we had more discussion about idealism. So the idea that consciousness or experience comes first before we have any understanding of the physical world as a third-person perspective. So like a world that is made up of mind-independent objects. For idealism, we start from the experience, we start from the mental, and famous proponents here are Berkeley, and of course the transcendental idealism from Kant. And then for neutral monism, we take kind of a third way, where we don't look at the matter or the mental, but we say that there is some kind of third substance, or in process philosophy terms, also it could be a process that has mental or matter characteristics. So if you paid attention to my little list here, I put Chalmers in the beginning and the end. This is just basically because the philosophical argument has been made many times that Chalmers' property dualism, so the idea that there is one thing that shows these two different properties, one mental property and one matter, is basically a form of monism and can be reduced back to what Spinoza already said. Okay, I'm not going to go over all these models of consciousness on the side here. I just started from a rather recent review from 2022 by Anisef and Tim Bain that listed the most discussed models of consciousness. And there are a lot of them here, so I'm just going to point out today. Nata already talked about active inference. This is something related to the free energy principle that I will discuss as a case study for model templates. Then we had the multiple drafts model. Maybe I can. The multiple drafts model by Daniel Dennett, which is over here. We have attentional schema theory. We have higher order theory, global workspace. What I want to say is like we have this plethora of models. And it makes intuitively, as like someone who just like started out in this field, it makes sense that a lot of the tools that we need for a minimal model of consciousness are already here. But we don't reach a consensus because we keep on building more models and not comparing them to each other to find something that is unifying between them. This here is a little small, so yeah. So my basic idea is that with minimal unifying models, we would have a common ground which we can compare new and old models with each other. And therefore, it's important to track, also from a historical perspective, how these mathematical tools come about, where they have been used, which ideas have been taken into new models, and which ideas have been put to the side. Okay, so Vanya Wiese's concept of minimally unifying models, he called it MOMS, and in his paper said the science of consciousness needs a mom, which yeah, I think was kind of a clever take on the state of the field right now. We're all running around doing our own research, and we need someone to like put us all on the same table and keep on talking. That's why I like these kinds of conferences. But philosophically, he defined the mom as 3 different properties that a model needs to have. So we're talking about minimal because we're talking about necessary conditions that are needed to explain consciousness. It's not about coming up with a sufficient model that explains all of the properties that we understand as conscious properties to explain the structure of qualia space and stuff like that. We just need this common ground, which builds on an empirically minimal model, meaning it specifies only the necessary features for consciousness. The second one, it has to be conceptually minimal. That means that it needs to have determinable characteristics, characterizations of properties that we actually can put to the test. And third, it needs to be minimally unifying. So it would highlight common assumptions and differences in the approaches that we're using at the moment. One example that comes up in a lot of recent theories is information generation as a necessary condition in models. So for example, compressing of information and like recalling in new contexts is something that at least IIT and free energy principle, multiple drafts model, they all have in common. But to say that consciousness is information generation would imply that it's not only a necessary but also sufficient condition. And if consciousness would only be information generation, then a lot of artificial systems that do some kind of information generation would also be called conscious. We already had a lot of discussion that, like, for example, large language models lack a lot of the features that we associate with consciousness. For example, some kind of understanding, some semantics, some action perception loops with the world. So large language models are information generators in that sense, but they don't interact with the world like biological organisms do. Another example that I prepared before was variational autoencoders, an idea from machine learning, where from data sets, a machine learning program, an algorithm derives representations that are very compressed and that can be used to generate new things that fit into the sample class. For example, if you give pictures of humans, it derives some representations, some internal representations, what makes a human face look like a human face, and then this can be used to make new human faces that were not part of the data set. So clearly this variational autoencoder generates information, but it's nowhere near what we need to let it count as a sufficient model of consciousness. Okay, so now we'll go into my case study, free energy principle and active inference. At least for me, when I got into this field, there are a lot of big names flowing around and it's not clear how they connect. So more for me, but maybe it's also helpful for you, I made this little structure here of related ideas. On the right, you can see from the top, the Bayesian brain model hypothesis to down to the free energy principle. We have connected theories that are usually put together. They're not exactly the same, but they all build on the same ideas. So this can be seen as, like, on the top you have biological inspired ideas, and on the top you have basically computational and computational explanation. So the Bayesian brain is basically all theories that assume that the brain does some kind of Bayesian belief updating. So this is a strong statement about neurobiological systems. If you go down, you come to predictive processing. So the idea that cognitive systems in general compare their predictions to sensory stimuli, which generates a prediction error. And the goal of a cognitive system is to minimize this prediction error. Active inference, the next layer down on, like, the more abstract side of this figure. Active inference also includes action as a way to minimize prediction error. And on the top, you have the free energy principle as a purely formal statement that all self-organizing systems minimize a quantity that is related to surprise. This quantity is called free energy. So basically, through our predictions, changing our predictions and acting on the world, we can minimize surprise about environmental states. So this comes with, as Clark noted, a shift in perspective where we're not computing input-output relationships in like a Turing linear sense of computation, but we have top-down predictions and we contrast them with external stimuli about our environment. Carl Friston, a neuroscientist who came up with the free energy principle together with a lot of collaborators, generalized that to the free energy principle, where free energy is a measure of surprise. You can also derive the prediction error directly from this principle. But the idea is why it is a principle and not a theory or a model. It's a principle because it's not falsifiable. It's in general a principle that needs to be implemented in a biological or neurological system, and then you need to make some assumptions about the structure of the system to actually test it. But you cannot falsify the principle itself, you can only falsify your implementation. The free energy principle also trades this natural attitude of direct perception, so the idea that we perceive things as they are and then we do computations on them, for this kind of active sense making where we sample the environment in a way to either confirm or contradict our predictions. So this is the generative model where we basically try to come up with a model that is as complex to describe the environment, but not too complex to overwhelm us in making predictions about the future. The free energy principle has been around since roughly 2009, highly discussed, but recently it was extended as a theory of computational phenomenology. So they want to describe how subjective experience arises in such an surprise minimization process. And for that, I'll just talk about it very shortly because I don't have a lot of time. And also, this is a preprint that came out in April, I think. So take it with a grain of salt. It has not been peer-reviewed. There's still a lot of discussion to be done. But this is like the state that I'm working off now. This is the state of the art of free energy principle. They explain the arisal of subjective experience by saying, in this hierarchy of top-down predictions and bottom-up sensory perceptions, there's always a border between. They call it the Markov blanket, which separates like the higher level from the lower level. And on this Markov blanket, this is where the differentiation between internal and external takes place. So they describe a cognitive system like humans as a nested hierarchy. So you have a lot of these blankets stacked on top of each other, doing different things. You can think about that like in the visual cortex. You have different parts of the visual cortex looking for different things in the visual stimuli. And they say the innermost part of this hierarchy is where subjective experience comes from. Mathematically, they reformulated it now as holographic screens, an idea from physics. But philosophically, I would say that doesn't change anything. So what they basically say is subjective experience is the innermost model you have. This is what Maxwell Ramstad told me, like in a personal correspondence, that it's models all the way down. Okay, we started kind of late, so I need to hurry up a bit. So I'm not going into the mathematical details, but if you're interested, we can discuss that later. So the free energy principle, as it's not implemented into specific neural structures, it fulfills the first point of Vanya's criterions for a minimal unifying model. It's empirically minimal. Then second, it's conceptually minimal. It has a characteristic property, free energy, something that if you make assumptions on how it is found in biological systems can be quantified. But is it unifying? I mean, we heard some talks about the projective consciousness model that seem to have some correspondences to free energy minimization. But people like in the IIT camp don't see a big overlap. So I would not say that as of yet it's minimally unifying. So it only fulfills two of these three conditions. This mostly stems also from unclear empirical implementations that are the usual criticisms. And another important paper, The Math is Not the Territory, by Mel Andrews from 2021, argues that the free energy model is not a model itself, but it only provides a model structure. So these are things that we still need to work on. The model template, I will just give you a taste, because I have a minute left, is what could track these different implementations of the free energy principle, makes it comparable for us. And I argue in a paper that I just submitted that we should understand the free energy principle as a model template, combining and unifying models and not phenomena. Usually it's explained as like explaining all cognitive phenomena, but I say no, it just unifies a lot of models that have been floating around before, which is a very interesting and epistemically important thing, but not the big claim that they usually give. So this is my conclusion. I hope I could convince you that we don't have to come up with more models of consciousness, but we need a better language, a common ground that we could start off, and that a minimally unifying model is needed to compare this plethora of models that we have been discussing and will discuss the next 2 days, and that free energy models could provide a minimally unifying model if we agree on interpretations and talk about where all these mathematical tools actually come from. So thank you very much. This is our research group. You can check out our webpage, possiblelife.eu. Yeah, we're at the University of Vienna, and I'm looking forward to your questions.